Welcome back to Study Hall, fellow learners. Today we're tackling a recent executive order.
Oh, this one.
Yeah, issued just a few days ago on January 20th, 2025. This order
It's got everyone talking.
has everyone talking, yeah, because it dramatically expands the military's role in U.S. border security. So our deep dive today will unpack this EO, dissecting its aims and potential consequences. The central question we'll be wrestling with is this: when does national security justify potentially overriding civil liberties?
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, and this EO brings it right to the forefront.
Exactly. So let's start by breaking down what this EO actually says. It aims to seal the borders and maintain the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of the United States by repelling forms of invasion. Those are some strong words.
Indeed. And the EO goes on to assign USNORTHCOM, the United States Northern Command, as the primary authority for border security.
And the kicker: it demands swift action, setting deadlines within days and weeks, not months or years. It defines threats quite broadly, including unlawful mass migration, narcotics trafficking, human smuggling and trafficking, and other criminal activities.
And it even calls for Level 3 planning, which is a level of preparedness typically reserved for major imminent threats.
So for those of us not familiar with military jargon, what does Level 3 planning actually entail?
Think of it this way. Level 3 planning means USNORTHCOM has to go beyond just assessing the situation. They need to develop detailed operational plans, ready to deploy troops, resources, and logistics to execute the mission. They also need to provide what's called a commander's estimate, outlining potential challenges and risks.
Okay, so this isn't just theoretical. This IO is pushing for action and fast.
Precisely, and that's what makes this so unprecedented and, frankly, a bit unnerving. To grasp the full impact of this, we need to look back at how the military has historically been involved in border security.
Right, because this isn't the first time troops have been deployed to the border.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been instances where the military supported civilian law enforcement agencies at the border, primarily in a logistical or surveillance capacity. For example, in the 1990s, under Operation Gatekeeper, the military assisted with border patrols in California.
But this new EO seems to go much further than just lending a hand.
You hit the nail on the head. This EO is a major shift. It's placing USNORTHCOM in a central, proactive role, which is a departure from the traditional division of responsibilities between the military and civilian law enforcement.
Okay, so we've established that this is a big deal, but why now? What are the stated goals of this EO? What's the administration hoping to achieve?
The EO outlines its primary goals as curbing illegal immigration, disrupting drug trafficking, and combating other transnational criminal activities.
On the surface, these seem like pretty important national security concerns.
And they are. Uncontrolled borders can pose real risks, not just in terms of illegal immigration, but also the potential for terrorism. Think about the possibility of individuals with malicious intent exploiting vulnerabilities to enter the country undetected.
That's a chilling thought. And we can't forget the devastating effects of the flow of illegal drugs, especially fentanyl.
Absolutely. The fentanyl crisis is a major public health emergency, causing tens of thousands of overdose deaths every year and disrupting communities across the country. Then there's the humanitarian crisis stemming from human smuggling and trafficking. These activities prey on the vulnerable and often involve dangerous and exploitative conditions.
So from that perspective, you can understand why the administration might argue that stronger border security is necessary. But, and this is where things get complicated, are there potential downsides to this approach?
Definitely. And those potential downsides are what have so many people concerned. One of the biggest red flags is the potential for this EO to clash with the Posse Comitatus Act.
For those of us who need a refresher, what exactly does the Posse Comitatus Act say?
Essentially, it's a federal law that generally prohibits the use of the U.S. military for domestic law enforcement. There are some exceptions, of course, but this EO could be pushing those boundaries.
And pushing those boundaries raises concerns about the separation of powers.
Exactly. Critics of the EO argue that it bypasses Congress, which traditionally has a significant role in determining military operations and immigration policies. They see this as a potential overreach of executive power, which is a valid concern when we're talking about something as fundamental as the balance of power in our government.
And there's another term that's been thrown around a lot: mission creep.
Right. Because the EO uses very broad language about repelling forms of invasion, some worry that this could be interpreted in various ways.
So what starts as securing the border could potentially expand into the military, being tasked with duties that go beyond their traditional scope.
That's the concern. And that raises ethical and legal questions. For instance, how would the military be trained to interact with civilians in a law enforcement capacity? What rules of engagement would they follow? These are uncharted waters.
It seems like the potential benefits of this EO, which we can't dismiss, are tangled up with some serious risks and trade-offs.
Exactly. And we haven't even touched on the potential impact on civil liberties. That's where things get even more complicated.
Let's dig into that. What are some specific concerns about how this EO could affect the rights of individuals, especially those living in border communities?
Well, one immediate worry is the potential for increased militarization of these communities. Imagine a heavier military presence with checkpoints, patrols, and even the possibility of military equipment being deployed in civilian areas.
It sounds like it could lead to heightened tensions, not to mention an erosion of trust between residents and law enforcement.
Exactly. And there are also concerns about restrictions on the right to seek asylum.
The U.S. has a long history of offering refuge to those fleeing persecution. But this EO could make it much more difficult for asylum seekers to reach safety.
The EO's focus on sealing the borders could be interpreted as a way to deter or even prevent asylum seekers from making their claims. And that raises questions about whether this violates international treaties and humanitarian principles.
And then there's the risk of profiling and discrimination based solely on ethnicity or national origin.
Absolutely. When you increase military presence and empower them to enforce immigration laws, there's a real danger of individuals being targeted based on how they look rather than on any suspicion of wrongdoing.
And that's a slippery slope that could erode fundamental rights for everyone, not just those at the border.
These concerns about civil liberties tap into a much broader debate about the balance between national security and individual freedoms. It's a debate that has been ongoing for centuries, but takes on a new urgency in this context.
It seems like we're being asked to weigh the potential benefits of increased border security against the potential costs to our civil liberties.
Yeah.
And that's a heavy burden to bear.
And it's a choice that we as citizens need to be informed about. We need to understand the complexities of this issue, the potential consequences, and the long-term implications for our society.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much to consider. Let's shift gears now and talk about the practical implications of this EO. Specifically, the impact on the military itself.
That's a crucial point that often gets overlooked in these discussions. One major concern is resource allocation and military readiness.
What are experts saying about how this EO could strain military resources?
Deploying troops to the border will inevitably divert personnel, equipment, and funding from other critical defense missions. So while the focus shifts to border security, other areas of national defense could be weakened or neglected. And there's also the impact on military readiness and morale.
How would being deployed to the border for extended periods affect the troops themselves?
It could lead to burnout, stress, and even a decline in morale, particularly if they feel like they're being pulled away from their primary training and mission. And that could have long-term consequences for the effectiveness and preparedness of our armed forces. We also need to consider the impact on international relations.
How could this EO affect our relationships with other countries, particularly our neighbors? I imagine this wouldn't go over very well with Mexico.
It's likely to strain relations with Mexico and other neighboring countries.
It's easy to see why they might perceive this as a hostile or aggressive move, especially given the history of U.S. intervention in Latin America.
Exactly. And it could undermine cooperation on shared security challenges.
Exactly.
Like combating drug trafficking or managing migration flows.
It could also damage the U.S.'s international reputation as a champion of human rights and the rule of law.
Yes, if the U.S. is seen as turning away asylum seekers or violating international treaties, it could erode our moral standing on the global stage, which could have far-reaching consequences.
We're already seeing ripple effects extending far beyond our borders. And we're just days into this EO being enacted.
And we haven't even touched on the potential for unintended consequences, which is something I always worry about when dealing with complex systems.
Let's dive into that. What are some of the unforeseen outcomes that experts are worried about? What could happen that maybe the administration didn't anticipate?
One concern is that stricter enforcement measures could actually worsen the humanitarian crisis at the border. If it becomes more difficult for migrants to cross safely, they might be forced to take more dangerous routes, putting their lives at risk.
So the EO might unintentionally make things even worse for people who are already struggling.
It's a paradoxical outcome that we've seen before with similar policies, and it could also push migrants into the hands of smugglers and traffickers who exploit desperate situations for profit.
So the very people this EO aims to stop could end up benefiting from stricter enforcement.
It's a disturbing possibility, and one we can't ignore. There's also the potential for increased criminal activity as smugglers and traffickers adapt to new security measures. They're always finding ways to circumvent obstacles, and often those ways involve more sophisticated and dangerous methods.
It seems like with every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, especially when dealing with something as complex as border security.
Exactly. We need to think several steps ahead to anticipate these unintended consequences. And finally, we can't forget the long-term economic and social costs of militarizing border communities.
What kind of costs are we talking about? What would this look like for people who live in these communities?
Well, there's the financial cost of deploying and maintaining a large military presence, which could strain local resources. And there's the social cost of living in a heavily militarized environment, which could lead to fear, anxiety, and a decline in quality of life. It could discourage tourism and investment, hindering economic development in border regions.
So the unintended consequences could end up harming the very communities this EO is meant to protect.
It's a complex situation with many layers to consider. There are no easy answers, but it's essential to have these difficult conversations and explore the potential implications from multiple perspectives. And this brings us to a crucial observation. This executive order has really sparked a heated debate, not just among legal and political experts, but in everyday conversations as well.
It seems like everyone has a strong opinion about it. I've seen passionate arguments on both sides.
That's what makes this EO so fascinating. It's forcing us to confront some really fundamental questions about what it means to be a secure nation and what sacrifices we're willing to make in the name of security.
It seems like a lot of people are struggling with that balance. Some argue that this EO is absolutely necessary to protect us from legitimate threats.
Right, and they have a point. The threat of terrorism is real. Drug trafficking is devastating communities. Uncontrolled migration does put a strain on resources. These are serious issues.
But on the other hand, we can't just ignore the potential consequences of involving the military in this way. What about the potential for human rights violations or the erosion of civil liberties?
It's a classic dilemma. How do we ensure security without sacrificing freedom? Where do we draw the line? And honestly, there are no easy answers. It's messy.
It feels like we're being asked to choose between two things that are both important. How do we even begin to untangle this?
I think it starts with listening to both sides, trying to understand the arguments without dismissing them outright. Let's break down the key points being made by both proponents and critics of this EO.
That sounds like a good place to start. What are we hearing from the people who support the EO?
Those who support the EO tend to emphasize the need for decisive action. They argue that the current system isn't working, and we need to take a stronger stance to protect our borders.
They might point to the increasing number of migrants attempting to cross the border or the flow of fentanyl into communities.
Exactly. They see the military as having the resources and capabilities to get the job done, to regain control of the situation.
They might also talk about the importance of sovereignty. The idea that a nation has the right to control its borders and decide who enters.
And that uncontrolled migration undermines the rule of law and puts a strain on social services and resources.
So their argument is essentially that this is a matter of national security and maintaining order.
Right. Now, on the flip side, critics of the EO raise serious concerns about its legality, its ethics, and even its practicality.
They might argue that it oversteps the boundaries of the Posse Comitatus Act, which, as we discussed earlier, limits the military's involvement in domestic law enforcement.
They worry about mission creep and the potential for the military's role to expand beyond its intended scope.
What about the potential for human rights abuses? That seems like a major concern.
Absolutely. Critics are particularly worried about the impact this could have on asylum seekers and other vulnerable populations who are fleeing dangerous situations.
They might also question whether the military is even the right tool for this job. Is this really a task for soldiers? Wouldn't it be more effective to invest in other solutions, like strengthening civilian law enforcement or addressing the root causes of migration?
Those are valid questions. And finally, critics argue that the financial and social costs of this approach outweigh any potential benefits.
It's a multi-layered debate with no easy answers.
Right.
But as you said earlier, it's a debate that we need to have.
We need to weigh the competing claims, consider the evidence, and engage in thoughtful dialogue. And we need to be aware of our own biases and how they might be shaping our perspectives.
It's easy to get caught up in the emotions of the moment, but it's important to step back and think critically.
Exactly. So what are some questions we should be asking ourselves as we try to make sense of this complex situation?
Well, first and foremost, what are the specific threats that this EO is actually intended to address? Are those threats real and imminent, or are they being exaggerated?
That's a key question. We need to look at the evidence objectively, and then we need to ask, is the military truly the best tool for addressing these threats?
Are there alternative approaches that might be more effective or less harmful?
We have to be open to exploring all options. And then, what are the potential consequences of this EO, both the intended and the unintended? We need to consider the full range of possibilities, both positive and negative.
It's like a giant chess game where every move has a ripple effect.
Precisely. And we need to think several moves ahead. We also need to ask how this EO aligns with our values as a nation. Are we willing to sacrifice civil liberties and due process in the name of security?
That brings us back to our original question, where do we draw the line?
Exactly. And what are the long-term implications of this policy? How will it affect our relationships with our neighbors? How will it shape our national identity?
These are all tough questions, but they are questions that we as engaged citizens need to grapple with.
And we need to ask who benefits from this policy and who bears the costs. Are we creating a system that privileges some groups over others?
These are all crucial considerations as we navigate this complex and controversial issue. There's no one right answer. But by engaging in critical thinking and thoughtful dialogue, we can hopefully move towards a solution that upholds both our security and our values.
You've given our listeners a lot to think about. It's clear that this EO is about much more than just border security. It's about fundamental questions of power, freedom, and what kind of nation we want to be.
And it's about recognizing that even in the face of uncertainty and complexity, we have a responsibility to engage with these issues, to seek out information, to challenge assumptions, and to make our voices heard. We spent a lot of time talking about the policy itself, but I think it's important to step back and remember the human impact of this EO. There are real people whose lives are being directly affected by this.
That's such a crucial point. It's easy to get lost in the abstract discussions of national security and border control. But we can't forget that these policies have very real, very human consequences.
We're talking about migrants fleeing violence and poverty, families seeking a better life, asylum seekers hoping for refuge. These are people with stories, with hopes and dreams. And on the other side, we have border communities grappling with the realities of increased militarization and service members tasked with carrying out these new directives.
It's a multifaceted issue with so many different perspectives and experiences. We need to try to understand those experiences, to put ourselves in the shoes of those affected by this EO.
Imagine you're a family fleeing gang violence in Central America, making that dangerous journey north, only to be met with an impenetrable wall of military force. Or imagine you're a Border Patrol agent who feels like your job has become increasingly militarized, blurring the lines between law enforcement and combat.
Or imagine the moral dilemma of a soldier ordered to carry out duties that conflict with their personal beliefs about the use of force or the treatment of civilians.
And what about the economic strain on a border town that relies on cross-border commerce and tourism, now facing the prospect of a militarized zone that discourages visitors and investors? The ripple effects are far-reaching.
These are just a few glimpses into the human stories that are often overshadowed by the political rhetoric and policy debates.
As we continue to grapple with the complex implications of this EO, we can't lose sight of those human stories. We need to strive to understand the experiences of those most affected by these policies, to listen to their voices, and to advocate for solutions that prioritize their well-being and uphold their dignity.
Because at the end of the day, the true measure of a nation's security lies not in the strength of its borders or the size of its military, but in its ability to create a society where all people feel safe, respected, and valued.
That's a powerful message to end on. This deep dive has been a journey through a complex and multifaceted issue, and it's clear that there are no easy answers. But by engaging with these challenging questions, considering diverse perspectives, and centering the human element in our discussions, we can move towards a more informed and compassionate approach to border security.
As we conclude this exploration, I want to leave you with one final, thought-provoking question to ponder. In a world grappling with both security threats and humanitarian crises, how can we as a nation find a balance between protecting our borders and upholding our values of compassion and human rights?
That's a question that deserves our continued attention, our thoughtful reflection, and our active engagement. Remember, knowledge is power, and informed citizens are the foundation of a strong and just society. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better future. Until next time, stay curious.